Russia expands its influence in the Middle East, serving as a power broker in Syria and beyond. Hello, I'm Mike Mulder, filling in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. Over the last 4 years, Russia has positioned itself as a major player in the Middle East. As the United States has pulled back, Russia has stepped up its commitments. That's never been more apparent than in Syria, where Russian and Turkish troops are now conducting joint patrols in northeast Syria. In October, Russia and Turkey reached a deal to move Kurdish fighters out of the border area in hopes of creating a safe zone for refugees. Turkey has taken in over 3 million Syrians during the conflict. Russia remains Syria's most powerful ally. And if it can bring an end to the 8-year civil war, Russia will have succeeded where the United States failed. Russia has also forged diplomatic ties with Israel, Iran, and Saudi Arabia, positioning itself as a geopolitical and military actor. For more on Russia's role in the Middle East, let's bring in our panel now. Joining us from Oxford is Samuel Ramani. He is a geopolitical analyst and doctoral candidate at the University of Oxford. From Berkeley, California, Reese Erlich is a journalist and author of Inside Syria, the backstory of their civil war and what the world can expect. Here in the studio, Cenk Karatas is a senior analyst on Turkish political affairs, and Victor Olevich is the lead expert at the Center for Actual Politics. That's a Moscow-based think tank. And why don't we start with you, Victor? As we all know, Russia intervened in Syria in 2015. It actually was, as many analysts say, a turning point for Bashar al-Assad. It seemed like his back was against the wall. Russia coming in really helped bolster his efforts. But it also was perhaps a turning point for Russia as well, cementing its place in the Middle East. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Well, of course, Russia today wields more influence in the Middle East than the Soviet Union had in the last years, in the last decade of its existence. I would remind the viewers that the Soviet Union, by the mid-1980s, did not even have diplomatic relations with Iran, with Israel, with a number of Gulf Arab states such as Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. And today, Russia has very good working relationships with all major players in the Middle East. It has built a relationship of strategic partnership with Turkey, which still remains a NATO member, but its relations with Russia and Iran are at such a point where they have not been for decades. Russia has also built a strategic partnership with Tehran, and that has been instrumental in Russia's growing role in Syria and beyond. So Russia's intervention in Syria has also had the effect of escaping the attempt at isolating Russia that had been tried by Western powers, by the United States and its European allies after the Crimean situation in 2014. So despite Western attempts to limit Russia's power projection, Moscow has been able to successfully increase its influence in the Middle East, both in Syria and in the neighboring states.
Cenk, let me ask you about the relationship between Russia and Turkey, because we all remember in 2015 this Russian warplane was shot down. There was a lot of reporting in the West. Is this going to be a wider conflict, and tensions between the two countries? Just last Friday, armored patrols, Russian soldiers, Turkish soldiers, joint effort, which I think in 2015 would have been unheard of. Talk to us about this relationship and what's going on there, because this was an agreement worked out between both of these countries, this area of Syria where they want the Kurds out, Russia and Turkish troops working in tandem.
Yeah, this relationship is defined by the leaders of both countries. There is this synergy, there is this compatibility between the leadership styles of Mr. Putin and Mr. Erdogan. So when, as you said, the Russian jet was shut down in late 2015, Mr. Putin said, we are stabbed in the back. But then as opposed to what everyone expected. They were able to fix things and move forward. This is due to a number of reasons. One of them is that they're in the same neighborhood, and they are facing the same problems and same obstacles ahead of them. Now, Turkey has some objectives, and Mr. Erdogan puts these objectives ahead of all the foreign policy decisions that he has made. For example, he wants to remain in power. He wants to have a stable economy, increasing sphere of influence in its region. So when we look at the Turkish perception on a global level, there has been an alienation of Turkey in the Western camp. And Mr. Putin is a mastermind of reading whatever Turkey and Mr. Erdogan needs along the course and then providing them. For example, Turkey experienced the catastrophic coup attempt in July 2016. When the Western governments are holding their words, Mr. Putin was on the phone with Mr. Erdogan on the same day of the attempt and offering some help. So this is laying out the partnership since then. They are having a big partnership in economic and energy issues. Mm-hmm. So the first and only nuclear power plant construction in Turkey is being built by the Russians. So the partnership in Syria also depends on the mutual objectives. When you look at the end game where we are right now, Russia has practically replaced the United States in northern Syria. So this is a big advancement for Russia, but also for Turkey. There were two objectives for the Operation Peace Spring that Erdogan moved forward with. One of them was to eliminate a possibility for a self-rule of the Kurds, like the YPG in northern Syria, and the second was the refugee issue. Both of these are very much related with the domestic politics in Turkey. So both leaders, depending on their personal relations and their synergy and chemistry, if I may say, moving forward in Syria to provide for each other. But the question is, how long would it be sustainable on this course?
And that's still to be decided.
If I may offer a comment?
Yes, Reese.
I think there was an accurate description of the Turkish-Russian relationship, but it comes at the expense of the Kurdish civilians. President Erdogan has talked about transferring 2 million Syrian refugees from Turkey into northern Syria, into the so-called safe zone. That's going to mean the displacement of Kurds. Already 250,000 or so Kurds have been forced to flee their homes as a result of the fighting in northern Syria. So the Russian cooperation with Turkey has very serious consequences on civilians in the area.
Well, let me go there because I was going to ask you the next question about the inconsistencies in the Trump administration, basically in alliance with the Kurds, and then as we all know, Trump basically turning his back on them, giving the green light to Erdogan to start his incursion, and then later saying that, well, we're going to move 500 American troops to guard the Syrian oil outposts there. Talk to us about these inconsistencies, and what has that done in terms of Putin moving in and taking his spot within where the vacuum's created by the United States?
Yeah, Trump has managed to make the worst possible set of choices and alienate everybody and still keep the troops in Syria at the end of the day. I mean, it's absolutely crazy. I think what happened was Trump decided that he wants to pull the troops out. When Erdogan said there was going to be an invasion, he agreed to pull back some 50 troops, and as part of a general redeployment that was going to follow. However, there was a tremendous blowback from Republicans in the Senate and Republican leaders in general, among the hawks in the Democratic Party who were criticizing him. And so he reversed course. And the argument that seemed to hold sway with him, as it always does, is, oh, well, the Syrian government has oil. Well, sure, we should occupy the oil fields and keep the Damascus government from controlling its own oil, which, by the way, is the real reason the U.S. sent troops there. It has nothing to do with protecting the oil fields from a supposed ISIS attack. And the result was chaotic. Troops pulling out, troops going in. At the end of the day, the U.S. started with some 1,000 troops in Syria, and by the end of this current redeployment, there's going to be 900. So it's not even like he's fulfilled his promise to bring the boys home or anything like that.
Well,
think
Reese, let me stop you there because I read your foreign policy piece with interest, and you touched on that in there, and I just wanted to read back some of what you say. Trump has managed to destroy U.S. credibility, anger allies, and embolden enemies without actually bringing the troops home, as you just pointed out. Russia, on the other hand, has played its cards well. I think about a year ago, I read a piece where it said that Putin's playing three-dimensional chess and Trump's playing tic-tac-toe. Another more recent article says Putin's playing three-dimensional chess and Trump's playing the fool. So talk to me about this strategically, the U.S. versus Russia.
Yeah. Well, of course, we're seeing the chaos created by Trump, who really is quite ignorant. I'm not entirely clear he could find Syria on a map, let alone think in long term there. But taking a step back, you know, Obama had tremendous problems in the Middle East as well. The decline of the U.S. started with the defeat after the Iraq War. I think the U.S. has suffered a series of defeats under both Democratic and Republican presidencies in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Iraq. And from that perspective, I think President Putin has indeed played his cards very wisely and carefully. He's selectively intervened militarily. He's got troops, or mercenary troops, in Libya now. There was an article in this morning's New York Times talking about that. He's got an alliance with Iran. And all of these places are places that either the U.S. once had significant influence or was vying for it, and Russia is coming out on top.
Sam, let me bring you into the conversation. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad recently in an interview says he doesn't want to make an enemy of Turkey. Let's listen to what he had to say.
We must ensure that we don't turn Turkey into an enemy. Now Erdogan and his group are enemies because he is the one leading these policies. However, until now, the majority of the political parties in Turkey were against Erdogan's policy. This is why we must ensure that we don't turn Turkey into an enemy. And here comes the role of friends, the role of Russia and Iran.
The role of friends, the role of Russia. Talk to me about Russia's influence with Damascus and Ankara.
I think that, Russia has got significant influence over Syria because of the fact that obviously it's got the military bases, the Air Force and the naval base presence over there. It's the leading entrepreneur that's calling for investments in Syria's reconstruction. And moreover, it's pulling the strings of the diplomatic process. The Astana process is now widely viewed, even by Arab countries in the region which traditionally have opposed Assad or have been lukewarm to him, from Egypt to the United Arab Emirates, to Jordan, to Lebanon, as the dominant and predominant diplomatic process. And if you were to look at the recent constitutional negotiations which took place in Geneva, what you will find is that the short list of 45 people, 15 from civil society, 15 from government, 15 from the opposition, the 30 that are part of the government and civil society, it consists of people who were in part handpicked by the Russians. So Russia has had quite a lot of influence in shaping the political process moving forward, and they have tremendous military influence and the ability to invest or facilitate external investment from China and other countries into the reconstruction process. So that is quite significant. And with Turkey, they're just trying to make sure that the Assad regime gets control over northern Syria as much as possible, and that Turkey's expansion is contained to the narrow strip, the 110-kilometer strip, instead of the broader 440-kilometer safe zone that could become a mission creep and could lead to more territorial annexations, like we saw in Afrin at the start of last year.
Cenk, let me bring you into this conversation with that in regards to Damascus and Ankara, because trying to navigate that can't be easy for Putin. Talk to me about that.
As a part of the agreement last month in Sochi, Adana Accord was brought back to table, and that promotes both parties in Damascus and Ankara to regard themselves as the counterparts in the resolution. I mean, this is big news. As for now, as we have seen, Mr. Assad is not willing to put Erdogan as a counterpart ahead of him, but it may not be up to him to decide, because Russia has a big game-changer value in this game. But for Erdogan, when the regime forces positioned right alongside the border of Turkey and Syria, Erdogan said it is preferable to have the Syrian government forces there as opposed to the Kurdish YPG, because it's their own land after all, quote unquote. So this was his words. It means that Mr. Putin is trying to push both parties to sit at a table for the future reconstruction of Syria, ultimately. It doesn't mean that it's all rainbows and unicorns, because there's the issue of Idlib, and there's the issue of YPG, so-called, some forces called as terrorists by Turkey are trying to be a part of, the Syrian military right now. So how are these going to be resolved alongside the way? And this will define how the Syrian reconstruction will begin, because right after that, there will be the juicy part will come. Because for Turkey, Russia is a regional partner and a global leverage. For Putin, Turkey is a means, maybe a disruptive force for the Western alliance. But in the midterm, there's the issue of the energy sources in Eastern Mediterranean. How are they going to be partnering together? So Mr. Putin would probably like to see Damascus and Ankara cooperating in drilling some natural gas resources in the Eastern Mediterranean. This will be a part of a bigger Middle Eastern ideal where the United States are going to be pushed way away from the game.
Victor, let me ask you about Putin and his relationship. I mean, when you look at some of the regional actors, obviously this has been a proxy war in Syria for some time, but you look at the regional actors there, Saudi Arabia, Iran, these rivalries, throw Israel into the equation, and yet Putin has a pretty good relationship with all of them. Does that give it more of a role, Russia more of a role as a power broker moving forward?
Well, first of all, I would not put all of the blame for American foreign policy failures in the Middle East on the Trump administration. In 1991, following the first Gulf War, the then George Bush Sr. administration had failed to honor its commitments to the Kurds when they were mounting a mutiny together with the Shia, against Saddam Hussein at that time, and it was considered an abandonment of the Kurds at that time. So what has happened today is not the first time that Washington has turned its back on the Kurds. Now, as far as the relationship between Washington and Ankara, the summer of 2016 coup that took place in Turkey took place when Barack Obama was the American president. And Erdogan at that time felt that the United States, Germany, and some other powers had been quite sympathetic to the coup plotters. And of course, Erdogan blamed the Obama administration for not extraditing Gulen, who was a prominent Turkish cleric living in Pennsylvania in the United States and supporting the coup plotters. So what we are seeing today is the harvest of the actions of a number of American administrations over several decades. What has been somewhat different, what Trump has added to this, is an overtly detrimental PR policy, which truly damages, which does damage America's national interest in the Middle East in a completely new way. But he's certainly not the first to make mistakes and not the only party responsible for America's troubles in the Middle East. Now, secondly, back to your question about Russia's growing influence in various Middle Eastern countries. Of course, Russia's predominant role in Syria is having an influence on how other Middle Eastern actors view Moscow. Of course, Saudi Arabia is looking at Moscow in a different way today than it had 20 years ago, when it had a very different relationship, when it was very critical of what was going on in Chechnya, when it was critical of Russia's foreign policy approaches. But today, Saudi Arabia and other Middle Eastern actors are seeing that Russia is indeed filling, at least partially, the vacuum left by America's foreign policy failures. And both Riyadh and Cairo and other Middle Eastern players understand that a close working relationship with Moscow is the key to promoting stability in that region, and that Moscow is going to be a significant player in the region for years to come.
Reese, let me ask you about, just to follow up on what Victor was saying about these missteps by U.S. administrations, of course, dating back, as he pointed out, to George H.W. Bush. Has that really kind of set the table for Putin in a sense?
It has, although I don't believe in the vacuum theory. In the United States, it's said that if the U.S. pulls out, then some evil power like Russia, China, or Iran will step into the vacuum. I think what we're seeing is actually an assertion of local control, or certainly local interests, against any outside occupation. And we see that in Iraq and Lebanon with the demonstrations, in Chile for that matter, in South America, some against the U.S., some against Iranian influence, et cetera. So I think the U.S. pulling out is a good thing, and the people of the region are in the process of settling their own issues in their own way without outside interference, hopefully. And I think Russia is going to have considerable problems in the years ahead. Now that it kind of owns the war in Syria, it may own the war in Libya, and that means reconstruction. It means reaching a political settlement between the Kurds and the government in Damascus, which is not going to be easy. It means resolving the fighting that continues in Idlib province in Syria. So yes, the U.S. is weakened as an imperialist power, but it's not going to be easy for some other country to step in and resolve the very complicated developments in that region.
Sam, let me ask you as a follow-up to that, just kind of to his point, is there a point where it's overreach, where Russia may regret how much influence they have in this region now?
Well, Russia has been very careful to kind of make this campaign quite cost-effective. For example, its airstrikes in Syria have only cost a small fraction of what their ground military presence in Ukraine has been, and they've outsourced a lot of the ground force and security responsibilities towards Iran. And now increasingly, I think in northern Syria, with cooperation and with Czech, some of that might be outsourced to Turkey. And in Libya, there have been some evidence, certainly of Wagner Group mercenary deployments and small-scale forms of assistance, but they've let the military heavy lifting and the financial burdens be moved to the UAE, Egypt, and other powers that are supporting Haftar more overtly. So Russia has been very careful and very shrewd to manage its costs so far, and has been able to maintain a balanced set of diplomatic partnerships in the region. And it's been able to position itself as a crisis arbiter. I think it's commonly a misconception in the United States and in many other Western countries that Russia is trying to replace the U.S. as the dominant hegemon in the Middle East or as the dominant security guarantor. In fact, it wants to be just one prong in a tripolar order. It acknowledges the U.S. military is here to stay, particularly in the Gulf, and be the dominant force for stability and security. It acknowledges that perhaps China is emerging as the leading trade partner, but it, by leveraging relations with all sides, not picking sides, and managing its involvement in regional crises, can act as a crisis arbiter and a diplomatic negotiator. Of course, even in Syria and in Astana and in Libya, a lot of this has been rhetoric, a lot of this has been bluster, and there's not been enough in the way of actual diplomatic successes. But Russia is positioning itself to be a low-cost, high-returns model that I think is sustainable in the years to come, more sustainable than some of their activities in the post-Soviet space.
Reese, the leaders from the Syrian government and opposition meeting in Geneva. Let's listen to what the UN envoy for Syria had to say about this.
I know that it is not easy for all of you to be here together in this room, and I respect that. I know that there are deep feelings among you, reflecting the deep feelings among all Syrians about the state of their beloved country after nearly 9 years of violent conflict. But the fact that you are here today, sitting together face to face, ready to start a dialogue and negotiations, is, I believe, a powerful sign of hope for Syrians everywhere.
Two sides are hoping to draft a constitution. There's no timetable, but it's worth pointing out that Patterson took over. He is now the fourth envoy. His predecessor, Stefan de Mistura, described the job as almost mission impossible. Is there any room for hope here?
Slim. I, of course, would like to see any peace process succeed, including the ones sponsored by the UN or the ones known as the Astana Peace Accords running parallel. But so far, I haven't seen any indications on the ground that the key forces are willing to engage in serious political negotiations. I think the biggest crisis after northern Syria is Idlib, where the ultra-right-wing militias affiliated with the Al-Qaeda group and using Islam as the excuse have been holed up and have been fighting the government in Damascus. And the Russian Air Force has been heavily involved in the bombing and attacks on Idlib. So that is a sore spot, as well as what's going to happen in northern Syria, as well as negotiations between the Damascus government and the Kurdish forces. So I'm not all that optimistic that the UN process is going to go very far.
Well, that's been the case thus far. It'd be kind of miraculous if we saw a different scenario. Let's talk a little bit about Turkey receiving its first S-400 missile system in July from Russia. Of course, that created some backlash here in the United States. Do you see Turkey pivoting more towards Russia? And it's a NATO ally. It's got kind of a balancing act as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, that is true.
It does.
Yeah. But the problem is that Turkey has been having a series of problems with its Western partners in terms of economy and strategic partnership. Look, the United States was supposed to be the Turkish strategic partner in their foreign policy in the Middle East and its region. But now, both Putin and Erdogan call themselves as the strategic partners. The S-400s were a corner point. It was very definitive in the relations because it marked Turkey's getting away from the NATO sphere, not because of its own mistakes. It was mainly due to some misalignment with its partners in the West. There has been a lot of developments, one after another, ruining the perception of Turkey in the West. Some of them were very with their base, but some of them were baseless. The problem is now Turkey is looking for a multilateral, multi-level, multinational partnership, not only with the West, but also on the East. So the Russians and the Turks are working together in terms of having a partnership in their own neighborhood, but I don't believe that Turkey is ready to keep itself away and disrupted from its Western alliance as of yet.
Victor, the final question for you. What is the end game for Putin and Russia in the Middle East?
Well, if we look at what Russia has already achieved in the past several years since its military intervention in Syria has begun, we will see that Russia has significantly expanded its military assets in Syria itself. Russia has been able to use the conflict in Syria as a testing ground for its newest weapon systems. And as a result, Russia has been able to increase its weapons sales around the world, not only in the Middle East, but in other regions. Russia has been able to bring itself in as a new, not the only one, and at this point, not the dominant one, but still a new power broker in the Middle East, and a new force to be reckoned with by various powers in the region and beyond. And in the coming months and years, Moscow is going to try to build on these achievements and move forward to increase its influence even further.
We're going to leave it there. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us, and thank you for joining us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.
Hello everybody, I'm Anand Naidu. If you enjoy the thoughtful, engaged discussions you see on The Heat, you may also want to subscribe to our podcast. It's appropriately titled The Heat. Twice a week we take a deep dive on world headlines, talking to experts, journalists and others. It's a fresh, focused and intimate look at the issues that matter most. Whether it's the Hong Kong riots, the latest Middle East conflict or US politics, the Heat podcast gives the clear context needed to understand both what's going on and why. And what's best, we come to you. Whether you're at home or on the go, you can find the Heat podcast just about anywhere podcasts are found. Just search The Heat CGTN. Have a listen today and subscribe. Thanks.